Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children.
You have declared a jihad against the...
For this and other acts of aggression and injustice, we have declared jihad against the U.S.
Twice when he was standing and once on the ground, just because it doesn't take long for a suicide bomber to clack his vest off, so I need to make sure he's not mobile at all.
For nearly a decade, the United States had been relentlessly pursuing one man, Osama bin Laden, the terrorist mastermind behind the September 11th attacks that claimed nearly 3,000 American lives and ignited a war that was still ongoing as of May 2nd, 2011. Despite the U.S. military's success in toppling the Taliban, the regime that had provided refuge to bin Laden at the time of the attacks, the elusive leader himself had evaded capture or death. That, however, was on the verge of changing. The CIA had been on the hunt for bin Laden's secret hideout for years, but he had proven to be a master of evasion. After slipping out of Afghanistan, which was under U.S. control, he managed to find sanctuary in Pakistan, a country with vast mountainous and rural regions where government authority was minimal. These remote areas provided the perfect cover for bin Laden to remain undetected. For years, U.S. intelligence agencies scoured for clues, but their efforts finally bore fruit in 2010. A lead directed them to a suspicious compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. This lead was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The CIA immediately began to gather surveillance footage of the compound, analyzing every detail to determine the most effective way to breach it. The operation that followed became one of the most complex and delicate intelligence-gathering missions in U.S. history. The compound was not only fortified but also located deep within enemy territory, making any direct action extremely risky. The U.S. had to depend heavily on local intelligence sources to gather critical information. Over several months, they monitored the three-story building, meticulously mapping out its structure and daily routines. Despite their extensive surveillance, many questions remained unanswered. They knew the layout of the compound and observed the daily patterns of its inhabitants, but they still lacked definitive proof that bin Laden was inside. The stakes were incredibly high and the margin for error was slim. The U.S. needed to be absolutely certain before launching any kind of operation. The mission required precision, stealth, and the element of surprise. Any misstep could result in a failure to capture or kill bin Laden, or worse, could trigger a political and diplomatic crisis with Pakistan. The planning process was exhaustive, with every possible scenario considered and contingency plans put in place. As the operation date approached, the tension and anticipation among those involved reached a fever pitch. They were about to attempt something that had eluded the world's most powerful nation for nearly 10 years. The final chapter in the hunt for Osama bin Laden was about to be written. Osama bin Laden had been known for his extreme secrecy, making it incredibly difficult for the CIA to obtain any visual confirmation of his presence at the compound in Abbottabad. Despite extensive surveillance, they were never able to capture an image of him entering or exiting the building. This left much of their intelligence circumstantial, but after months of careful observation, they reached the conclusion that this was indeed the location where bin Laden was hiding. With this belief solidified, the time had come to act. On April 29th, President Barack Obama was briefed in detail about the proposed operation. There was significant skepticism within his security team. The risks were enormous. If the operation failed, it could result in the deaths of some of the United States' most elite soldiers or leave them trapped behind enemy lines. Such an outcome would not only be a tragic loss of life, but could also lead to the exposure of highly sensitive U.S. intelligence if the soldiers were captured and interrogated. Moreover, there was still a lingering doubt about whether bin Laden was actually in the compound. Was the potential reward worth the risk? President Obama thought so. Despite the concerns, he gave the green light for what would become known as Operation Neptune Spear. The operation would be executed by SEAL Team 6, an elite unit within the Navy SEALs that answers directly to the Joint Special Operations Command. This team is tasked with some of the most sensitive and dangerous missions the U.S. undertakes, including counterterrorism, special espionage, and direct action against high-value targets like Osama bin Laden. The mission briefing made it clear this was a capture or kill operation. Although the U.S. officially holds a policy against killing an enemy who has surrendered, no one involved in this mission believed that bin Laden would ever surrender peacefully. Planning for the mission had been underway for nearly a year, ever since the intelligence reports had been. Numerous strategies were considered. The simplest option would have been a joint operation with the Pakistani military, but the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan was fraught with distrust. There was a genuine concern that if the Pakistani government were informed, bin Laden might be tipped off and escape once again. Another option was to strike the compound with stealth bombers, which could obliterate it and potentially kill bin Laden in the process. However, this approach left too much uncertainty. There would be no way to confirm his death, and bin Laden had a history of slipping away from U.S. forces at the last moment. Ultimately, the decision was made to go in the old-fashioned way, a direct raid by SEAL Team 6. To get SEAL Team 6 into the compound without being detected, the U.S. planned to use modified Black Hawk helicopters. These aircraft were designed to operate quietly and evade radar detection, crucial for avoiding confrontation with the Pakistani military, which had been trained and equipped by the U.S. The plan was to reach the compound, neutralize the target, and then retreat swiftly before the Pakistani forces could respond. On May 1st at 1:22 p.m., Defense Secretary Leon Panetta received the go-ahead from President Obama and ordered Admiral William McRaven to proceed with the mission. Within 2 hours, President Obama and his national security team assembled in the Situation Room to monitor the operation in real time, watching night vision images transmitted from a drone hovering above the compound. The 24 Navy SEALs assigned to the mission were temporarily placed under the control of the CIA. This technicality ensured that the operation would not be classified as a military mission, and thus not considered an act of war, which was a critical diplomatic consideration. These next few minutes would be some of the most critical in modern U.S. history, and for the SEALs on the ground, every second would be vital. While the 24 SEALs would be the ones to physically breach the compound, the entire operation involved 79 commandos and one highly trained dog. The dog, a Belgian Malinois named Cairo, was an essential part of the team, trained to detect any sudden activity, such as the approach of Pakistani military forces or attempts to escape the compound. Backing up the core team were additional personnel, including a dog handler, interpreters, pilots, intelligence agents, and technical experts, all crucial for the mission's success. However, the success or failure of Operation Neptune Spear ultimately rested on the shoulders of the men who would storm the compound. A single mistake could doom the mission and have far-reaching consequences for U.S. national security and international relations. The stakes had never been higher. At approximately 3:30 a.m., give or take a few minutes, 2 helicopters began their descent upon the Abbottabad compound, while additional helicopters remained on standby in case they were needed. These 2 aircraft were tasked with executing the primary mission. Flying close to the ground, the stealth Black Hawk helicopters hovered over the compound. The first helicopter deployed ropes to lower its team to the ground, while the second one headed to the far northeastern corner to discreetly drop off its interpreter, dog, handler, and 4 SEALs. If everything went according to plan, they would soon be at the compound. However, things didn't go as smoothly as hoped. Although the helicopters remained undetected and did not encounter hostile fire, Mother Nature intervened. The first helicopter encountered a vortex ring state an air phenomenon triggered by higher than expected temperatures that created an air vortex. As a result, the rotor's air pressure failed to diffuse properly, causing the helicopter to lose balance and graze the back of the compound wall. The tail rotor sustained serious damage, and the helicopter began to roll over. The quick-thinking pilot drove the helicopter into the ground nose first, preventing a total collapse. Despite the rough landing, the SEALs and crew were able to escape unharmed. The pressing question now was whether this mishap had compromised their secret mission. The answer appeared to be no, as there was no indication of aggression from the compound. The SEALs had managed to endure a crash landing without being detected. The helicopter was secure against the compound walls, and the other helicopter had safely landed outside the compound. The remaining team members were scaling the walls, and soon the entire team was reunited. The next step was breaching the compound, a task that fell to the SEALs explosives team. Speed was crucial. They needed to get inside quickly and overwhelm the people within with shock and awe. The external preparation was critical, but once they were inside, every second would count. 10 years of searching had led to this moment. At 3:33 a.m., to penetrate the security, the SEALs used portable explosives to blow open the doors of the compound's guest house one by one. They successfully breached the compound and began storming up the stairs. The first room they encountered on the first floor contained 2 adult males, but neither was Osama bin Laden. Although these men were detained, they weren't the primary target. More disturbingly, each floor seemed to house small groups of children, revealing that this wasn't just a terrorist compound. It was also a home where the terrorists kept their families, indifferent to the danger they were placing them in. With each floor the SEALs ascended, the threat level increased. By 3:35 a.m., reports of the following events may vary. As the SEALs reached the second floor, they encountered more resistance. It was here that they found bin Laden's courier, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. SEAL Mark Owen would later write a controversial book on the ensuing firefight, claiming that al-Kuwaiti was armed and fired at the SEALs. Although one SEAL was lightly injured, they returned fire, killing the courier. However, intelligence sources later suggested that the SEALs had managed to surprise the man after cutting power to the compound, eliminating him without resistance. What was clear, however, was that the SEALs still hadn't encountered their primary target. At 3:37 a.m., it was time to ascend once more, and the resistance grew fiercer the deeper the SEALs moved into the house. They had already encountered the courier along with his brother and wife, and all enemies had either been killed or captured. As they moved up the staircase, they confronted another adversary, one who offered a glimmer of hope. After neutralizing the Al-Qaeda soldier, the SEALs identified him as one of Osama bin Laden's sons, one of the many progeny who had followed in his father's footsteps. This discovery raised their hopes, suggesting that bin Laden himself might be close by. By 3:39 a.m., only one floor remained to be breached, the third floor. The SEALs braced themselves for another potential letdown. While it was clear this was a high-level Al-Qaeda compound, bin Laden had a history of staying one step ahead of his pursuers, and he could be long gone by now. But as the SEALs breached the third floor, it quickly became evident that this time was different. In the main room on the third floor, they found Osama bin Laden, apparently unarmed and dressed in the loose-fitting tunic he often wore in his propaganda videos. The SEALs got their first glimpse of him as he poked his head out of the bedroom. Seizing the moment, they immediately fired, wounding him. However, bin Laden managed to retreat into the bedroom, with the SEALs in pursuit. The room contained several of bin Laden's female relatives, including multiple wives. One of the women advanced toward the SEALs as if charging, prompting them to quickly shoot her, wounding her as they pushed forward toward bin Laden. At this point, the terror leader had nowhere left to run, and America's most elite soldiers were just outside his door. What happened next is subject to varying reports. Matt Bissonette, one of the SEALs on the mission, claimed that bin Laden was mortally wounded by the initial shots as they approached.
You flew over Abbottabad, you looked out the window, I imagine. What did you see?
Really just kind of, you're sitting there, you're zoned out, you got your helmet off, sitting in your lap, just kind of hanging out. You got the, you get a 10-minute call, 10 minutes from the target. So everybody, kind of starts putting their helmets on and getting ready. And, you get the 5-minute call and it counts down, 2 minutes.
His wives attempted to shield him, forcing the SEALs to act cautiously, as any one of them could be carrying an explosive device. However, when they pushed past the women, they found bin Laden on the ground, fatally wounded. As he made a move, they fired multiple shots, ensuring that the terror leader was neutralized for good. The entire operation had taken less than 15 minutes from the landing to the elimination of Osama bin Laden, making it one of the most efficient missions in U.S. military history. Remarkably, it was completed without a single death or serious injury to the entire Navy SEAL team. Watching from the Situation Room, President Obama uttered the words the entire White House team had been waiting to hear. "We got him, but the mission wasn't over just yet." At 3:55 a.m., the SEAL team members quickly sprang into action, securing bin Laden's body and moving it downstairs. Although they would be exiting shortly, there was still some extensive cleanup work to do. The compound could be a source of vital intelligence, so they thoroughly searched the room and surrounding area. They found 2 weapons in the room, an assault rifle and a pistol, but the efficient team had neutralized bin Laden before he could reach them. The weapons weren't even loaded, indicating that the Al-Qaeda leader was not expecting a firefight. But there remained the issue of the other residents. Almost everyone who had engaged the U.S. troops with weapons had been killed, but the compound was still full of civilians. The U.S. had no desire to take all the women and children found there into custody, so they restrained them non-violently and left them outside the compound to be found by Pakistani forces. Most didn't resist, with the exception of bin Laden's injured wife, Amal Ahmed Abdul Fattah. She berated the SEALs in Arabic for the entire duration of the cleanup mission, revealing herself as a true believer in her late husband's cause. Like most of the people found there, she would eventually be deported from Pakistan back to her home country in the Middle East. And now it was time to make a clean getaway. By 4:05 a.m., bin Laden's body and every important piece of intelligence or evidence had been secured. After gathering what they needed, the first helicopter was loaded and prepped for takeoff. Much like the landing, the takeoff was low to avoid detection. For those back in the U.S., the SEALs were heroes. But this was an unauthorized mission, and it was unlikely that the Pakistani forces would be grateful if they were caught there. However, just as they had done before, SEAL Team 6 executed a perfect getaway and exited the compound. But there was still one more issue to address. At 4:08 a.m., the damaged Black Hawk helicopter that had crashed into the compound wasn't going to leave through the sky, and with Pakistani forces expected to arrive soon, something had to be done. The chopper contained vital information about U.S. military capabilities, as it wasn't just a standard helicopter, it had been outfitted with stealth features. So, before departing, the troops used the same portable explosives they'd used to breach the compound to give their fallen chopper an explosive send-off. This took only minutes, and soon one of the backup helicopters brought on the mission arrived, picked up the remaining SEALs, and flew them off to join the first helicopter. The mission was complete, and now it was time for a long ride home. By 5:53 a.m., the ride back had taken over an hour and a half, more than 3 times the length of the mission that killed Osama bin Laden. But now that it was over, they had to return to safe territory, back in U.S.-occupied Afghanistan, where American forces had been fighting since the days following the September 11th terror attacks. While it was unlikely that the Pakistanis would fire on a U.S. chopper if it was detected, a stealthy escape would make for a smoother journey. To facilitate this, the U.S. troops engaged in some disinformation efforts. As the various explosions drew crowds before takeoff, an Urdu-speaking American military officer, claimed that a Pakistani operation was being carried out at the compound and urged people to keep their distance. The ruse worked, and the Americans landed safely at Bagram airfield, carrying the body of Osama bin Laden. Now it was time to deal with the aftermath. At 7:01 a.m., back at the White House, the celebration was tempered by one pressing question. Was it really him? Bin Laden was notorious for using body doubles, and there had been multiple occasions where it was thought he had been killed, only for it to turn out to be a deception. So everyone waited anxiously for the results of the preliminary examinations of the corpse. Over an hour after the SEALs arrived in Afghanistan, a new report came in confirming that the notorious rogue was indeed dead. This time, the United States had finally gotten their man, and the American public was about to find out. It was the evening of May 1st when word began circulating that the president was going to make a speech on TV that night. Typically, when Barack Obama delivered a planned speech, it was early in the evening during prime time, often to the annoyance of those trying to watch their favorite TV shows. But this unplanned speech, announced on short notice, was different. Political observers watched and waited as the president approached the podium just before midnight. And as soon as he opened his mouth, everyone knew this was big. At 11:35 p.m., President Obama began, "Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who is responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children." As the president honored the many who had lost their lives in bin Laden's attacks.
It was nearly 10 years ago that a bright September day was darkened by the worst attack on the American people in our history. The images of 9/11 are seared into our national memory. Hijacked planes cutting through a cloudless September sky. The Twin Towers collapsing to the ground.
A spontaneous wave of celebration erupted across the country. It had been nearly 10 years since the September 11th terror attacks, and many Americans had lived in fear of the next one. As news spread, large crowds at sports events erupted in cheers. Democrats reveled in what was the biggest foreign policy victory of the Obama presidency, while Republicans celebrated the demise of a common enemy, pondering whether running against Obama in the next election was even worth considering. Yet, there was still one crucial task left. By 12:59 a.m., a little over an hour after President Obama's speech, the troops had one final piece of business to handle: what to do with Osama bin Laden's body. The terror leader had been thoroughly tested and examined, confirming that he was indeed their target. He had been searched for any vital intelligence, but the body had no more secrets to give up. The only task remaining was to dispose of the body, but there was a significant problem. No country wanted to take him. Although bin Laden was wanted in nearly every country on the planet, even those where he had once found refuge, like Pakistan and Afghanistan, now considered him an outlaw. No nation wanted to risk giving him a grave, fearing it would become a pilgrimage site for radicals. The idea of cremating his body and being done with it was considered, but cremation is against Islamic tradition. It spread hatred for the terror leader. The US government still wanted to respect his faith, to avoid further angering his followers, especially after his recent elimination.
It was a joint decision. We thought it was important to think through ahead of time how we would dispose of the body if he were killed in the compound.
Fortunately, there was an alternative. Bin Laden's body was loaded onto the aircraft carrier Carl Vinson, and the US government sought approval from Saudi Arabia to dispose of the body, as he was a Saudi citizen. The Saudis, key allies of the US at the time, responded simply, "We don't care what you do with him, just don't make it our problem." With that, the plan to bury Osama bin Laden at sea was approved. The body was treated with Muslim religious rites, including a brief reading of Arabic prayers. It was then draped in a white shroud, placed in a bag weighted with hundreds of pounds of iron chains, and laid on a wooden board. As the board tilted forward, bin Laden's body slipped into the sea, ensuring that he would never have a grave that could be visited by loyalists or targeted by enemies. With the operation now fully complete, only the cleanup remained. Around 3 a.m. local time in Pakistan, the country's army chief received a phone call informing him of the operation that had occurred within their borders. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff provided the details, likely smoothing over some heated words. Although there was some initial dispute over whether any Pakistani forces had been involved, the government denied it, and reports indicated that Pakistani planes scrambled to the location only after the U.S. forces had already departed. However, the aftermath of the raid didn't end there. While the operation that killed Osama bin Laden had taken less than an hour, its repercussions would last for years. Controversy swirled around the legality of conducting the raid on foreign soil. Although post-9/11 laws gave the U.S. broad authority to eliminate threats abroad, Pakistan was far from pleased with the U.S. operating within its borders without permission. Meanwhile, the U.S. was eager to learn more about bin Laden's support network in Pakistan, but few answers were forthcoming. Conspiracy theories about bin Laden still being alive persisted, although the release of photos of his corpse by the U.S. government largely quelled those doubts. And there was one more inevitable consequence. As the operation was gradually declassified, various team members began releasing memoirs. While the details in these accounts varied, most painted the author as the hero. Naturally, it wasn't long before Hollywood took an interest. Just a year and a half after bin Laden's death, the film Zero Dark 30 was released, with the hero portrayed as a fictional intelligence analyst played by Jessica Chastain, because no major moment in American history would be complete without Hollywood adding its own spin. Want to learn more about this famous manhunt? Let us know in the comments